Appreciate all of you being here and being patient. Hopefully this is entertaining, and please, if you have any questions, interrupt me. I will lose my train of thought anyways, so please just feel free to holler. I'm happy to answer anything that you'd like, and we can talk about that as best to my knowledge as I can. I think it's great. You all were here obviously yesterday for Joe's talk, which I think very much intermingles with mine, and I'm very glad that we got to have our talks again. I think Joe's sterling and a very exceptionally smart man, and I'm excited to go over some of this stuff with you all. Certainly, there are many important dates in American history. I wrote 1649 up here, but before we begin all that, I'd like everybody to take a moment, and I did this last time, but I'm going to do it slightly differently. I want you to think of a moment in American history that makes you particularly proud to be an American. Just take a moment, and it can be anything. It can be minute. It can be a Fourth of July parade in your town. It can be a historical moment. Mine's going to be a historical moment that I'll talk about in a moment. Anything like that. It could be a song that is written. Anything like that. Does everybody have something? Anybody mind sharing? I would love to get like 2 or 3 people to share. Yeah.
William Clark writing "Ocean in view, oh the joy," as him and his expedition reached the Pacific Ocean.
That's a great pick. Anybody else? Yeah.
Drinking beer and shooting things and blowing them up on your property.
And it's a perfect.
Small town.
And it's a perfect time for that, I think.
Valley Forge.
Valley Forge. Okay, mine's going to be very similar. One of mine, and we have just written this piece about Battle of George Washington going across the Delaware and capturing the Haitian troops and catching the Germans unawares and capturing them with hardly any casualties. America had been horrendously losing the Revolutionary War, and Washington was taking defeat after defeat after defeat after Adams had staked much of his reputation on getting him instilled. And he gambled everything to go across this ice tundra on Christmas, which maybe wasn't considered the most noble time for a sneak attack. And Washington would receive a reputational damage for this. But it was so integral to the American victory that this man, with nearly, and we're being a bit facetious, but with almost a barefoot army, crossing the Delaware and taking this entire German mercenary army by storm. Almost no casualties on the American side at all. It's truly a wonderful moment. We were the underdog against this Imperial British Empire that had hired German mercenaries. We still didn't even have the French yet on our side. We were alone in the dark, and Washington took a gamble. And it sends chills. I think for all of you, there's probably something that you're very proud of, you think is very beautiful, that's very American. And I think that's something very wonderful. I want to start with 1649 in Maryland. There are a few different visions of how the United States began. I think we talk about sort of a religious underpinning, as Joe put it, a profiteering undertaking. We're going to focus a little bit on those 2 camps that came in 1642. I'm sure many of you have heard of the English Civil War that was brewing and absolutely decimating England. And this was one of the biggest, in the 1640s, one of the biggest migrations to North America from the English settlers that would come. It was blood and carnage, and so many were escaping. Some for economic reasons. A lot of came for profiteering, for adventure, for a bigger chance it would later be the slave trade that we talked about, and they would come. Then there would be a great deal many who would go to the north, as we talked about in 1620, to Plymouth, but who would continue trickling in. Cromwell was particularly nasty to the Irish, but also to the Catholics in general. And there would be other groups as well that would continue to come into the northeast United States. And so we almost have 2 American foundings. One by the economic indentured servants and adventurers who'd come to Virginia. And in fact, those would be my ancestors who'd come to Virginia. And then there would be the Puritans and others who came to New England. So there's these two coexisting American foundations. And 1649 in Maryland. Now, Maryland back then was technically slightly a part of the South, but it had a meeting of minds between the mix of the North and the South. And in 1649 is when what we would become to understand as the First Amendment. The idea of freedom of religion would be passed in Maryland. And there were some colonies that had religious freedom, some that did not, but Maryland specifically passed a law that allowed for it. And it's a very interesting notion. And Joe had talked about this sort of the different groups in New England that came who were escaping religious persecution, but then offered no religious diversity to other peoples. Now this would partially change. Rhode Island being an exceptional example of that. Also Georgia's foundation later being not only religiously extremely tolerant, but at first attempting to be anti-slavery as well. But Maryland has this sort of meeting of these two cultures in one, and they pass this Religious Tolerance Act. And they also begin passing what we know as the other part of the First Amendment for freedom of speech. This was extremely important to the development of the United States. And these ideologies were frankly quite radical and quite new. As many of you know, the Protestant Reformation War, or the wars in Europe that had left continental Europe absolutely decimated after Luther posted his 99 points, were horrific. Absolutely horrific. And many early Americans decided that some idea of diversity and religious tolerance was a particularly strong thing. Now, some of them differed on the degree of what that might be. Certain thinkers, like Roger Williams, that we thought were much more open-minded about what religious ideologies. We'll talk about a bit later. George Washington was very open to a numerous amount of religions being here and was very happy. He actually had a very strong correspondence with the Jewish population in Charleston and was great friends with them. Invited them to Mount Vernon often. And there's a very special memento if you make it to Mount Vernon. There's a menorah there. One of his best friends was a Sephardic Jew from Charleston. But there's these back and forths of different places for religion, ideologies, diversity of peoples. And Maryland is one of these first places to really siphon and hold that, and what would later be the fomentation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. We're going to now move a little bit further along. A lot of interesting things do happen, but I want to take us to our noticeable founding, in the 18th century. So we'll move a little bit past this. And we get to a lot of the wonderful founders. I'm only going to talk about a few of them. Lamentably, one of my very favorite, Patrick Henry, I will not be talking about. But if you have any questions about him later, I find him absolutely enthralling. Would love to talk about him. But we're going to be talking mostly about Adams and Madison. And as I said, America is almost a tale of two cities. It's a tale of one religious founding and one economic founding. And Adams and Madison are going to be a tale of this. There's Hamilton and Jefferson could just as easily be inserted here. I chose not to talk about Jefferson as much because I think I talked about him last time. And I don't think I've gotten to talk about Adams very much at all. We have first two different ideas of the Revolutionary War that emerge. It's very popular in parlance now to discuss that we fought the Revolutionary War because of the tyranny of the king. There's actually a large swath of people who thought the king was benevolent and beholden to the Parliament. The Parliament had basically made a thrall of King George, and that he was just a figurehead. Adams was in that camp. There's a letter that's written to the king that says, please, your Parliament is absolutely bonkers. Restore it. Us Americans deserve equal rights. Adams, both him and his cousin, the famous brewer, write about this, the natural rights of the colonists. It's a great piece. It's borderline piece of propaganda, but it's a wonderfully written piece that is by John Adams' cousin, Sam Adams. And John helped write that as well. And they wrote for a very different reason. Then you have others who, like Madison, who had issues with the entirety of the British government, who had entire issues with basically the idea of no representation. All of them had issues with no representation. But Madison disliked Parliament and the king. He was an equal opportunity hater, so didn't take any issue with that. And then you have others who, Patrick Henry, I'll talk about slightly, who didn't mind Parliament, didn't want to be part of it, but didn't mind it, and absolutely hated the king. So you have a whole gamut and range of folks who are all arguing, and all of them have different backgrounds, very diverse and different backgrounds. John Adams comes from an impoverished farmer family. His mother's lineage, they had some prowess in medicine, what we were discussing earlier, they were surgeons, which are effectively barbers, who are of no great wealth. And then his father's family are just farmers. And he just grows up religious on a farm in Braintree, Massachusetts. And John struck everybody. I mean, we have this pretty working class farmer family. I'm sure at least many of you are familiar with that. You can picture sort of that in your mind. And John was exceptionally brilliant. He'd memorize parts of the Bible and talk with his father and then argue with his father about it, because what good teenager doesn't do that? And his dad and the rest of Braintree scraped together money to send him to school, to send him to Harvard. And he got in, and his dad said, please come back and be a preacher. Come back and be a preacher. And John basically said, F you, that's not what I'm going to do. And John was deeply religious, very deeply religious. He said, F you, that's not what I'm going to do. He decided that he wanted to be a lawyer, foolish mistake, but he ends up becoming a lawyer and coming back to Braintree and being quite a successful writer. Again, at school he had a lot of issues because he was religious and from working class. Now, the Ivy League schools, Harvard and Princeton, actually used to rank their students when they'd come into the class. They would not rank them by academically, they'd rank them by social standing. Adams ranked 20th out of 21 students in his class in social standing. The only person worse than him was the kid of a baker. He was ostracized, made fun of. There was some tolerance of religious thought, obviously, there. There were certainly preachers who would go there. Yale actually would have a more openness to religious thought that would emerge, particularly for Episcopalian and Jewish thought that would come from Yale. But Harvard less so, and Adams entered in as one of the lowest social standing. He got the crappiest dorms. He had to work while being there. And he actually got a job being a commentator in a newspaper. He would write anonymously, and he was paid, and he would give the most wacky opinions, but he eventually fell on something that a lot of people in Cambridge, Massachusetts didn't have. And that was a connection to common folk. Adams would listen to what they said. He'd be out and about, and he would listen to what they say, and he grew up a part of it, and he would voice these concerns, especially in 1765, but these would continue, whether it was the Stamp Acts or the Sugar Acts, these things that the Townsend Acts that Adams would write about. And Adams had a deep, deep love of what he called moral truths. Now, Adams believed these were grounded in Christianity, and he would write about these, that there was an essential truth that emerged from these things, and he would write about that. And Adams is one of my very favorite figures. There was a time, once he finishes school, he still writes anonymously for a newspaper. He's practicing law. And he actually takes very unpopular positions in his legal profession. After the Boston Massacre, he represents the British soldiers who killed the Boston civilians. And he wins at trial. which is wild to me, that he ends up winning this trial. And he believes that all people are entitled to inalienable rights, that there are people who deserve the best defense possible, and that is a natural right of the people. And that stems from what Adams will point to a biblical truth. Jefferson and Madison will find that same truth, but not from the Bible. We'll get there in a bit. But Adams ends up defending these men who killed his countrymen. And Adams is sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. He is not quite yet a diehard secessionist by any means, but he is very critical of the crown, of the British government in general. He still thinks that can be reconciled, but he'll later obviously come to a different conclusion. Another key figure who was not all guns-ho, kill the British, was Franklin, who came around very slowly to the idea, but they do eventually reach that. And we'll stop on Adams, and I think we'll jump to Madison.
Before you do that,
Yeah.
what was his denominational background for Adams? Like, what kind of the religion?
He was Puritan.
Puritan.
Yeah.
Specifically, can you expand on that? Like, 'cause I don't know.
Joe is the better person to talk to about the religious side. They were,
Were
and
they like a branch of
they're a branch of Protestantism.
Anglicanism?
It emerges from England.
It emerges from
So
Anglican.
was the theology very similar? The liturgy message very similar to the
Yes, but they were.
Anglican thing?
Yes, but less. There was a lot more devotion to text and text practice, if I'm correct. And you'll have to forgive me, religion, like the actual practices of religion are not my expertise, but they were much more devout to religious text understandings. But they emerged from a Protestant Anglican thought pool. That's a great question, and again, I'm glad Joe's here too to back me up for religious thoughts. Does anybody else have any?
If we're wrong, we can hang together.
Hey, I'll take it. So Adams is from that religious camp and family. And then I'll take you to the more monstrous and the camp I'm more familiar with on that side is Madison. Now Madison is, I think, probably the smartest founder of all of them. Madison, unlike Adams, did not come from a working class family. Madison came from a very well-to-do slave trading family, plantation family, Montpelier. And Madison he's very funny. I find him to be probably the most humorous of the founders. He was 5'4", very sickly. And he loved to talk about how he was basically one of the greatest athletes at Princeton. Princeton didn't have any sports at the time. And so he thought it was very funny to talk about that sort of stuff. And again, obviously nobody believed him. He's literally, he's quite small, but he's intellectually a titan. Madison, at the time, he spends his free time not horseback riding or enjoying the countryside. He just becomes absolutely obsessed with Paine, Montesquieu, Locke, these great thinkers, and he just ends up writing prolifically. And he is also very sickly, and they blame the weather on his sickness, because most of the elite in Virginia at the time were sent to William and Mary, which is a actually wonderful and beautiful school that I highly recommend everybody visit. But most of the elite sent their kids to William and Mary. And Madison actually ends up, he's quite smart, does well, and they're like, well, we'll just send him to Princeton. And he goes to Princeton, and he ends up meeting other founders there, but has a heck of a time, really enjoys it, intellectually grows significantly. And Madison becomes very famous, sort of for that. Madison is not religious. Okay? His uncle is a preacher, but in the Virginian, more what would later be Episcopalian thought pool, which is a much softer emergence from Anglican thought than Puritan ideology. Madison's not deeply religious, and I'll briefly touch on, Jefferson was at best an agnostic. He would be described as a deist in his time, but he's further than Madison's not quite that intense. But Madison is studying in school, and he actually becomes really obsessed with the idea of diversity of thought, diversity of peoples, and diversity of religion. And Madison sees this, obviously he was not alive in 1649, he sees this, he looks at the English Civil War, he looks at the battles in Europe, he's reading Locke, he's very much a Lockean, and thinks that we can build something great and something peaceful and have a root. He recognizes the importance of the Puritans and their thought pool, but he says just as much the Catholic, the Jew, and the Muslim are supremely important to the development of American thought. And so he actually works on what will be almost verbatim the First Amendment, and he also drafts basically the entire Constitution and the Bill of Rights that we enjoy today. But he drafts the Virginia version that talks about freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. Madison was obsessed with that stuff. He would later regret a little bit the freedom of press, as does Adams. We'll talk about that as we get there. And these two end up meeting in Philadelphia, and they instantly hate each other, which is great. Whereas Adams and Jefferson actually are friends at first. They disagree on a number of issues, but they respect one another. These two don't. There is a split. Both of them, I'd say everybody's united around respect for George Washington. I think that's what held together a lot of these people who had very different ideals for why they were fighting the war, had very different ideals for the foundation of the country, what the country ought to look like. I mean, you have to remember Franklin, who's one of my favorite founders, absolutely detested Germans and hated them coming into the country, thought they were ruining it. Madison thought it was great. He was like, these are industrious peoples, keep it coming, especially if we can use it to kick the British's ass. So you have a very much peoples who had a different understanding of the foundation of America, the role of religion in America, the role of different peoples in America. And it'll be represented really by these two camps. What'll be the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans who tend to emerge. And it's wildly funny because Adams comes from this working class background, but the Federalists end up morphing into the professional class and this idea of a powerful central government. The Democratic Republicans, which is its leadership almost as entirely plantation owners, end up becoming the symbol of the working class. So it's very interesting how that split ended up happening. But at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, there's a number of arguments, but Madison ends up crossing the bridge a little bit. And Madison's idea is that, well, we can't agree on a number of things, but maybe we can agree on a compromise. Madison writes the Constitution, he writes the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan is this idea that what effectively would become the House of Representatives, modeled off of the House of Commons in Parliament. And Madison says, let's just do that. That's good. We'll have that, we'll have our president, we'll have a Supreme Court. Good enough. Now, there are smaller states who disagree with this, obviously. And they say, well, no. First, we can't trust who just randomly gets elected into the House of Representatives. We need a Senate, which is effectively the House of Lords in Parliament, modeled and named after the Roman Senate. And back then, the House of Representatives would actually pick the senator who would go in. And then also the state would have an input as well. But Madison ends up writing this entire Constitution, much to the chagrin of Patrick Henry and the people who are even further who are against the adoption of the Constitution. He says we don't need a Bill of Rights because there are natural rights that exist that we don't need to codify. He convinces Hamilton, who's probably somewhere here on the spectrum, and they write the Federalist Papers altogether to support the adoption and ratification of the Constitution. And so they do end up convincing enough people to vote on this issue on a compromise plan that includes both the Senate and the House. And the Constitution is born. Madison instantly regrets not putting a Bill of Rights in and hurries along and scurries along to get everybody to get a Bill of Rights. And actually, Adams is on board with this, even though it includes this idea of freedom of religion. And I want to take us to something very special, because I think we need to talk a little bit about the specialness of the United States. A lot of what we have is built upon the shoulders of others. We're very blessed. From Averroes to Cicero, we've adopted great things from the Levant, from Rome, from Greece, from Athens, Jerusalem, from London. But there's things that are also distinctly American. One of those is, we'll just talk about the Bill of Rights in general, but the Sixth Amendment, the right to counsel. It used to be the King's Bench, miraculous for its time, by the way. I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that these were wholly horrible things that existed in England or in Europe. The King's Bench would not usually assign a lawyer to somebody in a criminal proceeding, okay? And there wouldn't be a trial. There would be a judge, and a judge might preside over a quick hearing, and then there would be a ruling and a punishment. Now, something very different that was very important to both Adams and Madison was this idea of, well, for serious crimes, you deserve a free attorney. That it's not fair for the state to have an attorney to prosecute you, or no attorneys at all and a judge to just condemn you. You need somebody who can argue and advocate on your behalf, who knows the rule of law. That was miraculous. That did not exist. There were trials in Rome. They did not have that. England did not have that. There was something very, very American about that. Benjamin Franklin writes, he'd rather let 100 guilty people walk free than one innocent person be condemned. That's a very American thought that does not exist in England, does not exist in Rome. And what's surprising is it doesn't exist in Rome. The thought of the Catholic canon. Miraculous that it's something the founders could all really, 90% of them could get behind. And they really believed in it. That 100 guilty men should walk free than one innocent man be incarcerated. The idea of all of the different amendments, and we'll march through some of them. We've talked a lot about the First Amendment. The Third Amendment was particularly, somebody surprised me, they knew it. It's such an unpopular amendment. No quartering. You don't have to house foreign troops or your own troops. It used to be that armies would just station camp, take your food. You were there to support. Nathaniel Greene, the Swamp Fox in the Revolutionary War, great general, he lamented that Washington and Adams said, you can't just ransack your own people's stuff. He's like, I'm fighting the British. Let me ransack, and we'll pay them back eventually. Y'all can pay them back. Part of it might have been principle, part of it might have been that the Congress had no money. But so they said, don't do that. And miraculous, the Fourth Amendment, there's no search and seizures without a warrant. How do you get a warrant? You have to even go to a judge, and somebody has to demonstrate there's a reason. Now, the Fifth Amendment, double jeopardy, the takings clause of the Constitution, that if the government, first of all, the government can only take things from you for public purpose, and they have to compensate you justly. And that's decided by a jury of your peers to the Seventh Amendment. Even in civil trials where the government takes something from you, you get a jury trial. That's unheard of. So it's not just a judge who's paid by the government who makes that determination. A jury of your peers from your county or from your district, they get to determine if the government fucked up or not. That's radical. 12 people, Louisiana 10, damn French law. They get to determine that the government messed up. They get to say, you don't get to pay. Let's say the government decides to take Warren's house. And the government says, Warren, I think your house is worth $5 today. And Warren's like, that's baloney, absolute madness. So Warren sues the government. He goes right, he says it's a Fifth Amendment violation, it's a taking clause violation. And Seventh Amendment says he gets a right to a jury trial, okay? Even in a civil case. And those 12 people in Nashville say, yeah, we think that that's actually worth $1.5 million. Government just loses. That's it. Game over. No nation in the history of the world did that. And that's because of these dudes. That's radical thought, who disagreed with one another. And there's huge arguments in Philadelphia and later New York about is what is the limitation of the right to counsel? What is the limitation to a jury trial? But they end up getting it passed because they just believed that these certain values were so integral that no matter what, these needed to be in there. Now, they left a footnote, and we can either thank or curse Jefferson for this, that there are ways to amend the Constitution. Okay, you can take out, if we all by a supermajority disagreed with this now, I think it was actually ingenious, but just know that it has, obviously it's a double-edged sword. We could decide that there's no more Sixth Amendment. We could just say no more right to counsel, toast. No more First Amendment, toast. Some presidents, including, we'll talk about them, Adams in a minute, fundamentally disagreed with the First Amendment. But Jefferson left in this clause that he mandated Madison leave in. Madison and Jefferson are really good friends. Jefferson looks upon Madison as a little brother at this time. Monroe will also be part of that family of proteges to Jefferson. But they're convinced to leave that. So there's this idea of flexibility. The Constitution is a test of time. It has words and values that we hold, but it can change if a supermajority of people decide to change it. I mean, remember Jefferson wanted basically every generation to be able to change it. Madison was like, whoa, simmer down, dude. We got to have some stability here. And also, I don't think I can get everybody on board with that. That's hard to sell. And I'll impress upon all of you that Jefferson was quite radical for his time on a number of issues. We'll talk in many of these people. I don't want to talk too much about this today. They're very gray and complicated, like all of us. Jefferson, I mean, he had a plantation and owned slaves, and certainly not a good thing. And he actually recognized that it was a bad thing, which might even be worse. He recognized it was a bad thing and continued doing it. But he then also wrote the Northwest Ordinance that abolished slavery in what would be later part of the Midwest. He was a huge advocate for ending slave trade, as was Madison. Slave trade, what I mean by is port to port outside of the United States. Also ending slave trade in general, and they wrote about it in their own personal diaries, but said that's a problem for future generations. We can't do that right now. So a lot of these characters are very, very mixed. You have a boy from Braintree who's religious and stands up for British soldiers who ought to be condemned and believes in constitutional rights, but hates the parts of the First Amendment and also wants no religious diversity or tolerance at all, and also hates slavery. Then you have a guy who says, we need a diverse society, one that has equality of opportunity, of the ideas of diversity of thought, but also has a plantation and owns slaves. So we're complicated, complex creatures. And, Madison sort of cut his teeth in the House of Representatives. He was Speaker of the House, as Mike Johnson is today. And he was, for a little while, friends with some of the Federalists, was in their inner circle. He would give reports of Congress to George Washington. Now, Washington, during the basically Cold War with, would be the beginnings of the Cold War with France, but then also during the Shay and Whiskey rebellions that would happen. There were early rebellions to the United States on taxation without representation. Pot, kettle, unfortunately. Madison critiqued Washington and said Washington was sort of a do-nothing and a sellout to Virginians, and Washington was a very sensitive person. He did not take criticism well, so he banished Madison. And Madison was banished. He was never allowed to go to Mount Vernon again, which he never went to the rest of his life. He did not go to what was then the president's mansion. Remember, D.C. did not exist at this time. It was in Philadelphia and then partially in New York. And he was kicked out of those circles. He comes hat in hand to Jefferson and says, please help me. Jefferson says, look, Adams fucking hates me. Washington's borderline. I'm not sure I'm much help to you. This is sort of the burgeoning of the Democratic Republicans. But at this time, Adams' career skyrockets. Adams was voted, he's the first vice president. He was the diplomat to Great Britain for peace negotiations. He was later a diplomat to France. France did not care for Adams. They thought he was too religious. He thought they were libertines. So Franklin did much better in France, as did Jefferson. Adams, not so good there. And Adams is a very popular figure. He's a very good writer. He's almost like a preacher lawyer. He does a very good job. He convinces a lot of people, and he represents a lot. He's able to get the vote still of the working class and the Federalists. And he says, look, the Democratic Republicans are basically, yes, Madison wrote the Constitution. I'll give him that. Adams gives him that. He says, yeah, he's a great writer. But these are the guys who basically stood behind the Articles of Confederation and wanted to watch the United States fail. Wanted to watch the United States be run into the ground. Who really only believed in states and not so much in a federal government, and it would have failed. He's being a bit hyperbolic. Madison was not. Patrick Henry is definitely a part of that camp. Madison and Jefferson believed in the federal government and adapted it for a reason. Madison wrote the fucking Constitution. He obviously believed in it. Back then, ads against one another were quite mean and quite harsh. They would say very mean things about one another. Adams ends up winning the election, and he becomes our nation's second president. And Adams is very into neutrality, like Washington. He does not want to. Remember, American sailors are being impressed and taken into naval services by the British this time. This is the beginnings of Napoleonic France. There's a lot of hullabaloo going on in the world that's setting the stage. A war of the coalitions, sort of the First World Wars that we're seeing. Adams wants to remain neutral. Madison and Jefferson are very much pro-France. Let's ally with France and take out the British. But Adams wins, and then Adams, in his victory, I'll call ignorance, but I'll let you all judge, he passes the Alien and Seditious Acts, which basically say the First Amendment doesn't exist anymore. And if you critique the government, if you critique me, you will be imprisoned. And those other rights, like the Sixth Amendment, well, you'll get to them eventually. You know, we've got a long wind up before you get to trial, buddy. You have the Speedy Trial Act, but when you're president, you get a lot of leeway to play with things. And at this time, I'll say Congress and the Supreme Court were still learning their roles. It would not be till Marbury v. Madison that there is a real understanding of what the role of the Supreme Court is going to be. Each branch, even though the Constitution doesn't say this, and Madison eloquently argues this, each branch thinks that they get to be the interpreter of the Constitution. It's great when you think you get to make whatever you say is the law. All of them thought that. Remember, only Congress can make the law. The president executes the law, and the Supreme Court judges it and says if it's actually legit or not. That's it. Each branch, I think, did not appreciate that. Madison says, this is your role. I wrote the Constitution. It says it in the Constitution. Madison, when he becomes president, then says, oh, no, the executive actually gets to do all of this stuff. So everybody's a little bit of a hypocrite. That's fine. But Adams is part of this Alien and Seditious Act. And I think we'll take a quick break for a moment. What time am I even at?
It's 11:10, so you want to come back at 11:25, 15 minutes?
Yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Can you give us one or two great examples of the mean things that Adams and Madison are saying about each other?
Yeah. And Adams actually, he was deeply religious, so he would not say these things. He would have his friends. He thought, if any of you are like more familiar, there are religious people who will find other people to do things for them during, it's like cheating. I don't understand, like why do this? So Adams, from his background, would not write mean things, but he'd pay his friends to do it. And he had no issue at all with doing that for some reason. So he said Madison was actually a descendant of dwarf people, and gave him, and he said he's not from actually Virginian stock, that he was adopted from the same family, Hamilton's Caribbean dwarf family was, and even though Adams and Hamilton were on the same side, they actually got into huge verbal fights as well. Hamilton was definitely not above writing. Hamilton is probably the best writer of the founders in that sense. I mean, he's very funny to read. The mean things he would say. Basically, he's the one who just blasted Jefferson for being an atheist. He actually snuck into Jefferson's house and tried to get a copy of the Jefferson Bible that he heard about. And he looked for it and he couldn't find it. He couldn't find it. So the founders were not all above reproach. Madison wrote about Washington that he was so good he had his tree stuck up his ass. They were not always so nice. Jefferson also was very much one with, Jefferson wrote really mean things about Adams. And Jefferson and Adams would grow to hate each other. And I originally was going to do the talk with Jefferson versus Adams because they actually end up reconciling toward the end of their life. And I will talk about that. But the founders were really mean to each other. The only one who was probably, he was still kind of a jerk was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin he would be mean to himself too. That was one of the things, yeah.
So I'm curious, and this is kind of, I guess, tangential, but Washington obviously is like very much Virginia planter, but there's not just with him in Madison, there is like a general falling out between him and those guys, right? Because I know Tom Paine turns on Washington.
Oh yeah, they all do.
What is that? Because you always think it's like Washington wins unanimously both times, like.
So that's a great question, and something that's not a lot talked about. And Patrick Henry leads this revolt against Washington. Okay, they view Washington as like an absolute traitor to Southerners. He ends up becoming a Federalist. They even actually somewhat blast Madison. Madison is kind of the bridge at the moment between the two worlds. And also Henry fucking hates Madison. Thinks he's a kiss ass, which he was. But Henry leads this revolt of the Virginia elite against Washington. Jefferson doesn't really partake, but yes. I mean, Governor George Clinton of New York basically writes about this. It's like, this is absolutely wild that they're all turning on Washington. And it's because of Washington's, not just his enthusiastic support for the Constitution, but his support for federal power and the curtailment of states' rights. Again, there are actually multiple rebellions against that happen at the early United States. And Patrick Henry thinks Washington's a stooge. He thinks he's there for all, and there might be truth to this, that Washington really only cares about his legacy, and he's there for glory. And that's why he's so sensitive. And Madison and Henry end up patching it up and becoming friends after Madison's kicked out of Washington's inner circle for critiquing him. A lot of people thought that this idea of LARPing as Cincinnatus was ridiculous, and that Washington was not special. I disagree. I personally disagree. I think it was fairly magical that Washington was able to walk away from the crown when potentially offered it. But a lot of Virginia planters thought his LARPing as Cincinnatus was bullshit and really heavily critiqued him. And actually Henry ends up, though, much to his credit, and it's one of the reasons why he's my favorite founder, Washington writes to Henry when what would become later known as the First Secessionist Movement sort of begins in the South. There's a much bigger one that actually happens in the Northeast in the 1810s and 18 But he writes to him and says, Henry, I need your help. Like, I'm fearful the United States is going to fall apart. And Henry, to his credit, basically tells everybody to fucking stop and says, you need to support Washington. And if we do not come together, Henry, in my opinion, saves the Union the first time. But that's a great question. Yeah, he was not beloved by a lot of people.
Do you think there's sort of this you mentioned earlier that like a lot of the revolutionaries, like they actually, before they kind of built themselves up to the revolution, if my memory stands then you sort of mentioned this, a lot of them were actually kind of on the king needs more power, parliament needs less. Was Washington, even back then, kind of on the like Hamilton wing of like strong executive, like the parliament is kind of a problem?
Washington actually waited to make a call, which is one of the reasons he's critiqued. He did not, and I actually think this is sort of to his credit, he didn't want to be involved in like he said, I will be there for the revolution, I will be there for the American cause, but he did not want to take a hard stance. Hamilton does obviously end up convincing him. Hamilton and Washington are like, for those of you who don't know, Hamilton is his understudy, his protege, and the thinker behind a lot of the actual administrative apparatus of the United States. Undoubtedly, probably one of the reasons why America is great, because of Hamilton, who does all of these thinking and writing to help Washington. He's really the mind behind that first administration that keeps America afloat. And really, if I can walk away with something aside from reading the Bill of Rights, which I think is wonderful, the Federalist Papers are dynamite. I mean, him, John Jay, who will be the first Supreme Court Justice, and Madison all write the Federalist Papers. Federalist Paper 10, which is written by Madison, Federalist Paper 11, which is also quite good, Federalist Paper 51, all these discuss these. But yes, Washington does not take a stance at first. Hamilton later convinces him. Washington does it so he's not perceived as being involved. Others critique him and say his lack of involvement further demonstrates his idea of just being this LARPer as Cincinnatus.